"The locks are changed, Mom. You don't live here anymore." My son Ethan forced those words out, refusing to meet my eyes. His wife Chloe stood right beside him, her arms tightly crossed, wearing a grin as smug as someone who had just won the lottery. "My name is Martha Miller." For 58 years, life has taught me one hard truth. Nobody hands you safety. You earn it through every scar you carry. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stepped off the long-distance bus after visiting my sister in Georgia, only to find that my own flesh and blood had rented a massive commercial moving truck to wipe my entire existence clean. The bus hissed to a halt, leaving me standing alone on the highway shoulder. The rubber handle of my worn-out suitcase bit hard into my palm. My legs ached from a week of heavy labor on my cousin's farm, but a quiet warmth hummed inside my chest. I was finally coming home. Number 402 on the quiet outskirts of Raleigh, North Carolina. A house my late husband Arthur and I had spent 35 long years paying off, brick by brick, through every economic downturn. Home isn't supposed to feel unfamiliar. As I turned the corner onto our street, the warm golden glow of my porch light was missing. Instead, a massive commercial moving truck idled right in my driveway, its diesel engine rumbling heavily against the late afternoon silence. The sharp scent of old cardboard hung in the air, mixed with the scratching sound of packing tape being ripped off rolls. The white wooden porch swing, the one Arthur had handcrafted for our 10th anniversary, was already unhooked, leaning coldly against the rough bark of the old oak tree. Before my mind could process the wrongness of the scene, 2 movers walked out of my front door, carrying something that made my breath catch. My mother's antique Singer sewing machine. The heavy iron-legged machine I had used to stitch winter coats for Ethan when we had nothing left in the pantry. "Hey, what do you think you're doing with that?" I dropped my suitcase, the small rubber wheels clicking against the concrete as I hurried up the steps. The front door swung wide open. Ethan turned around. He was 32 years old, yet he looked like a terrified child caught stealing. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mild autumn breeze. He stared fixedly at his polished loafers, completely unable to look into my face. Ethan finally admitted they hadn't expected me back so soon. Everything had already been arranged. The house had been sold, and they had even picked a retirement home for me without asking what I wanted, stumbling over rehearsed excuses about senior health care. The world tilted violently. I didn't scream or cry. 58 years of being a working-class widow had taught me how to freeze panic into solid ice. Without a word, I stood my ground. Ethan flinched, instinctively thrusting a thick leather folder toward me. "Just take it, Mom," Ethan muttered, his voice shaking. "We're trying to do what's best." Chloe stepped forward with a triumphant smirk. She wore designer sunglasses, looking like a ruthless real estate shark. "Don't look at us like monsters, Martha," Chloe snapped, waving the paperwork in the air. "You signed it. You gave us full authority to handle the property." I took the folder from her hands. My calloused fingers turned the pages under the street lamplight. I stopped at the final page. There it was, my signature at the bottom of a document titled Senior Tax Relief and Healthcare Proxy Assistance. I remembered that rainy Tuesday afternoon, a month ago. Chloe had shown up with a warm cup of tea and a stack of forms, telling me it was a routine government update to help me save money on property exemptions. I had trusted her. A quiet, dry chuckle escaped my lips. They thought they had outsmarted me by tricking an old woman into signing a routine financial paper disguised as elder care assistance. They were so blinded by greed that they forgot the fundamentals of the law. A standard financial power of attorney grants rights over bank accounts. It does not, and legally cannot, override a property title locked inside a federal, irrevocable trust. I closed the leather folder. I lifted my chin, looking straight past Chloe's grin into the terrified eyes of the son I had raised. "You calculated every detail, didn't you?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "You packed my life into boxes." Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "It's a shame," I whispered, stepping past them toward my door, "that neither of you bothered to check whose name actually holds the master key at the county registry before you tried to sell something that was never yours." Before my son could answer, the deep rumble of approaching engines cut through the tension in the driveway. Two sleek, polished SUVs turned off the main road and pulled smoothly onto our property, signaling that the final act of their elaborate plan was about to unfold. Melissa stepped out of the lead vehicle first. She was a middle-aged real estate agent dressed in a sharp business suit, carrying a thick leather portfolio under her arm. Behind her, a middle-aged couple, the prospective buyers, stepped out of the second car, their faces bright with the eager excitement of closing on what they thought was a clean, legitimate home purchase. Melissa smiled brightly, walking straight toward me as if she were arriving at a joyful family gathering rather than an illegal eviction. "Oh, Martha, there you are," Melissa called out cheerfully, her voice ringing across the pavement. "Ethan and Chloe told me you had already moved into the retirement center earlier this week. I didn't expect you to drop by just to witness the final handover. How thoughtful of you." I didn't smile. I didn't offer any polite small talk to feed her illusion. I simply stood straight, fixing a cold, steady gaze on her that made the veteran real estate agent instantly stall in her tracks. I'd known Julian for more than 30 years. Whenever he slowed down instead of speeding up, I knew someone else was about to panic. With the calm, measured tone of someone who had weathered decades of storms, I spoke clearly enough for everyone on the driveway to hear. "Melissa, you are a senior real estate agent in this county," I said, every word crisp and cutting. "Before you accepted their deposit and pushed this transaction through, did you personally verify the original master deed at the county recorder's office? Or did you just close your eyes and trust whatever my daughter-in-law handed you?" Melissa lost her smile instantly. Her expression turned pale as a sheet, and she instinctively took a hesitant step back. Of course I checked," she stammered, her voice suddenly thin and nervous. "Chloe provided a complete package of financial power, of attorney and legal representation documents signed by you last month. Everything had signatures and stamps." Seeing Melissa falter under my gaze, Chloe immediately pushed her way forward, clutching her leather portfolio even tighter against her chest as she pulled a folded set of papers from her bag and waved them aggressively in the air. "Stop trying to buy time, Martha. Look at this," Chloe snapped, her voice sharp, defensive, and dripping with arrogance. "You signed a special asset management and healthcare proxy agreement right here. Our attorney reviewed it thoroughly. It grants us full legal authority to manage and dispose of this property to secure your future. This house belongs to us now." The prospective buyers exchanged deeply uneasy glances. The husband stepped closer to Melissa, lowering his voice in a sharp demand. "What is going on here? Is there a problem with the title?" Ethan stood frozen behind his wife, swallowing hard as sweat poured down his pale face. For the very first time, he looked into my eyes and saw no wavering, only a chilling certainty. A primal, suffocating instinct gripped him, whispering silently that everything they had built on a foundation of lies was about to collapse. Then, the final piece of the puzzle arrived. A sleek black sedan pulled up quietly alongside the curb just outside our front gate. The door opened, and Julian Vance stepped out. He was an elderly attorney who had stood by the Miller family for over 30 years, and more importantly, my late husband Arthur's dearest lifelong friend. He wore a dark classic suit and carried a simple leather briefcase, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who knew the law inside and out. Julian walked steadily through the open gate, nodded politely to Melissa and the bewildered buyers, and came to a stop directly beside me. He set his briefcase on the concrete, calmly unlatched the metal locks, pulled out a thick, official file stamped with the heavy crimson seal of the Wake County Records Office, adjusted his reading glasses and smoothed the top sheet of paper. Nobody moved. Even the movers stopped looking at each other. The truck engine suddenly sounded louder than anyone's voice in the quiet afternoon air. I turned my gaze from the bewildered buyers to my son and his wife. A quiet, knowing smile touched my lips, a smile that instantly drained every last drop of color from Chloe's face. "You claim this house was sold using that power of attorney?" I asked softly, letting the silence stretch before delivering the blow. "I'm sorry, Chloe, but the paper you tricked me into signing only covers a few spare dollars and a basic checking account. As for this house, it hasn't belonged to us, and it never will belong to your whims." Attorney Julian Vance did not raise his voice, yet every syllable cut cleanly through the tense afternoon air. He pulled the top document from the official file, his movements deliberate and unhurried as a cool afternoon breeze rustled the crisp papers in his hand. "My name is Julian Vance, legal counsel for the Miller Family Protection Trust," he announced calmly. "I suggest everyone here listens very carefully to find out who actually holds the legal right to sell this property." Julian opened a thick, deep blue leather folder. He didn't look at Chloe or my son Ethan. His eyes remained fixed on the official record stamped with the Wake County seal. "As of October 12th, exactly 3 years before the passing of Arthur Miller," Julian read aloud, his voice steady and formal. "The deed to the residential property located at 402 Oak Ridge Lane was formally transferred into the Miller Family Protection Trust. This is an irrevocable legal entity registered under state and federal guidelines. The prospective buyer, the middle-aged man who had just wired a massive deposit, froze completely in his tracks. He turned his head sharply toward Melissa, the real estate agent, his face draining of all color. The two movers slowly paused and set a heavy cardboard box down on the concrete driveway. Melissa blinked rapidly, her lips parting in sudden, unadulterated confusion. The buyer's voice tightened with sudden, sharp panic as he demanded answers about the $1.2 million he had wired into the escrow account that very morning, staring directly at Melissa to ask whose name was actually on that trust. Melissa didn't answer. She couldn't. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared blankly at Julian's file, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her own leather portfolio. Julian didn't pause for their panic. He turned the page, his finger tracking down a specific clause printed in bold legal text. "According to the foundational rules of the trust," Julian continued, "any transaction involving the sale, transfer, mortgage, or encumbrance of this property strictly requires the explicit, written, and notarized consent of Martha Miller, acting as the sole and exclusive trustee." Julian raised his eyes, looking directly at the prospective buyer. "Without Mrs. Miller's signature on the official transfer deed, any contract signed by any other party is legally void, null from its inception, and carries no binding weight whatsoever." Before Melissa or the buyers could fully process the gravity of those words, Chloe lunged forward, her composure completely shattered. Gone was the smug, triumphant real estate mogul. In her place stood a panicked woman whose elaborate scheme was unraveling in real time. Chloe snatched the blue folder straight out of Julian's hands, her fingers shaking uncontrollably as she flipped frantically through the pages. She shrieked in high-pitched panic that the document was a complete fake, screaming accusations that Julian and I had cooked up the papers just then to cheat them, insisting over and over that her power of attorney overrode everything because I had signed it. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice to match her hysteria. With agonizing slowness, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, laminated verification card containing a federal digital verification scanner and a secure QR code tied directly to the state's electronic land registry database. "Feel free to check the registration numbers right here, young lady," Julian said, his tone biting and completely devoid of warmth. "Every single trust document registered in this county is backed by a verified legal notary seal and a state ID number. If you believe this is forged, I invite you to call the state property registrar right now on speakerphone and accuse the federal government of fraud." Chloe's hands began to shake so violently that the folder slipped from her grasp, rustling loudly as it hit the concrete pavement at her feet. She stared down at the paper scattered on the ground, her lips moving silently, her face completely pale. She was completely, utterly speechless. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the low idle of the moving truck engine in the background and the sharp hiss of the afternoon wind carrying the autumn leaves across the lawn. Slowly, deliberately, I shifted my gaze away from Chloe and looked at my son. Ethan had stepped backward, once, twice, until his back hit the side of the moving truck. He stared down at the documents on the ground, then slowly raised his head to look at me, and finally turned his terrified eyes toward his wife. That was the first time I saw fear replacing pride in his eyes. It wasn't the fear of a child afraid of a parent's wrath. It was the chilling realization of a grown man facing the absolute truth of what he had allowed. Strange enough, I wasn't thinking about winning at that moment. I was just thinking about how quickly trust can disappear when people mistake love for weakness. The absolute reality of what they had done, attempting to throw their own mother onto the street with forged paperwork, settled heavily over his chest like a physical weight. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped his core as he realized the legal trap his wife's unbridled greed had dragged him into. The prospective buyer stepped back, his expression turning cold and furious as he glared at Melissa, demanding his money back out of escrow right that second, or else his attorney would sue her entire agency out of existence before the sun went down. Melissa burst into silent tears, fumbling blindly for her phone as panic overtook her career. I didn't say a word. I simply stood beside my longtime friend, Julian, watching the house of cards collapse under the unyielding weight of the truth my husband had prepared for me years before. Before Chloe could find her voice to argue back, the sharp wail of a police siren cut through the quiet neighborhood street, slicing cleanly through the tension hanging heavy in the driveway. A black and white cruiser, bearing the emblem of the Wake County Sheriff's Department, turned smoothly into the driveway, pulling up right behind the empty space where the commercial moving truck had idled. The driver's door opened, and Sheriff Miller, a tall, weathered officer who had known our family for decades, stepped out. He didn't need to shout or raise his voice. One single sweeping look around the yard at the stacked boxes, the scattered legal papers, and the pale, frozen faces was more than enough for a veteran lawman to grasp the entire situation. He rested his hand casually on his utility belt as he walked toward the steps. The prospective buyer hurried forward to meet him, his face flushed with adrenaline and panic, stammering out an urgent plea that a massive fraud had just taken place and pointing a shaking finger straight at Chloe and Ethan. Sheriff Miller raised a firm hand to pause him, his expression hardening into stone. "Hold on. Acknowledging the gravity here, nobody moves a single box," Sheriff Miller announced, his voice booming with authority as his eyes swept across the entire yard. "Until my department verifies the status of this property title and investigates potential civil fraud and forgery, this entire scene is frozen. No furniture leaves this house and no keys change hands." Instantly, the two professional movers reacted. Without waiting for Chloe's screeching protests, both men dropped the cardboard boxes they were holding back onto the dolly. One of them jogged back to the rear of the moving truck, unlatched the heavy metal door, and began hauling my mother's antique Singer sewing machine, carefully placing a protective cloth cover over it, and the wooden chairs right back down the ramp onto the solid concrete. The lead mover looked straight at Chloe, his face cold and unyielding. "Lady, count us out. Our company policy explicitly forbids us from touching any property involved in active title disputes or ownership fraud. We're not risking our corporate carrier license for your mess." Chloe shrieked in absolute rage, lunging forward as if she could physically force them to load her stolen future, screaming that they had hired and paid them. "And you're getting a full refund minus the gas fee because we're leaving right now," the driver snapped back, slamming the truck's rear door shut with a heavy metallic echo. Within seconds, the diesel engine revved hard, and the massive moving truck backed out of the driveway, abandoning Chloe and Ethan completely stranded in the middle of their crumbling fantasy. While the sheriff stepped aside to take the prospective buyer's preliminary statement, my longtime attorney Julian Vance didn't waste a single second. He turned his attention directly toward Melissa, the terrified real estate agent still paralyzed near her SUV. Julian didn't shout. He walked toward her with the slow, calculated steps of a seasoned litigator entering a courtroom cross-examination. He calmly reminded her of her strict professional liability as a licensed senior real estate broker, emphasizing the absolute fiduciary duty to perform a thorough title search at the county registry before clearing escrow funds. Melissa flinched as if she had been physically struck. She looked wildly around for an escape route, but the sheriff's cruiser blocked the driveway exit. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, her professional mascara running in dark streaks down her flushed cheeks, and she didn't dare lift her eyes to meet anyone's gaze. She stammered in a broken whisper that she hadn't checked the courthouse database herself, confessing through heavy tears that she had blindly trusted Chloe's claims about a fast cash sale for medical expenses and skipped the secondary verification step just because the commission was massive and she had been rushed. Julian's tone turned ice cold, cutting through her excuses. "A personal power of attorney," he reminded her, "holds zero legal weight over a federally protected, irrevocable trust." Melissa burst into full, uncontrolled sobs, covering her face with her trembling hands as she slumped heavily against the side of her SUV. The harsh spotlight of professional negligence had exposed every shortcut she had taken for a quick paycheck, and she knew her career was over. I stood quietly on the porch steps, watching the dominoes fall exactly the way the truth demanded. The buyers were walking away to call their own attorneys. The movers had fled. The agent who enabled the crime was staring down the barrel of a permanent license revocation. The hardest part of that afternoon wasn't losing face or dealing with the chaos. It was the quiet, sobering realization that total strangers were standing up to protect my home, while the people I had raised and loved had tried to tear it all down from beneath my feet. Once the flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser finally faded down the street, and the bewildered buyers and weeping real estate agent had driven away, absolute silence settled over number 4. O2. The heavy entrance door remained wide open, letting in the chilly autumn draft. The driveway was empty, save for a few discarded packing forms blowing across the concrete. I walked slowly into the living room. The space was half empty, stripped of several boxes, yet the familiar scent of old cedar wood, lingering medicine, and lemon polish still hung in the air. Without a word to Ethan and Chloe, who stood paralyzed near the threshold like stray dogs caught in a thunderstorm, I crossed the room and sat down in Arthur's old leather armchair by the corner window. The springs groaned softly beneath my weight, a familiar, comforting sound that had anchored our lives for decades. For a long, quiet moment, I simply stared at the worn wooden floors, letting the fading afternoon sunlight wash over my hands. Looking back now, 35 years vanished in a single heartbeat. I closed my eyes, and the empty room melted away, replaced by the ghost of a winter night from decades ago. I could still see Arthur in my mind's eye, sweating as he single-handedly built the side brick wall, kneeling in the freezing rain to patch the leaking roof shingles, or falling fast asleep in that exact same chair, his calloused hands still clutching a hammer after working a 14-hour shift. I remembered the nights he used to carry a tired little Ethan on his broad shoulders, whispering about the bright future they would build together on this land. Every single dollar we earned went toward paying off this home, brick by brutal brick. We ate bread and water for months when the economy crashed in the 90s. We gave Ethan every single advantage we never had, paying his tuition through college, hoping we were building a secure foundation for his future. Instead, success didn't make him grateful. It made him soft, entitled, and blind. And then he married Chloe. The memory shifted, pulling me back to a Tuesday afternoon exactly 2 years ago. The sunlight had been filtering through these very same windows, casting long amber shadows across the carpet. Arthur was bedridden then, his chest hollowed out by the aggressive cancer that would claim his life a few weeks later. His skin was paper white, and his breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps, but his mind remained as sharp as a razor. Julian Vance had been sitting right where he was today, holding a thick stack of legal drafts. I could still hear Arthur's raspy, worn-out voice echoing in the quiet room as he looked past me toward the doorway where Ethan and Chloe had just finished visiting. "Martha," Arthur had whispered, his bony hand trembling as he gripped mine. "Look at our son's eyes when he talks to his wife about our savings. He's not our boy anymore, not the one we raised. He's wrapped around her finger, and she only cares about the ledger, the status, the market value." I had shaken my head back then, defending our only child with the blind devotion of a mother. "Arthur, you're just exhausted from the pain. Ethan is a good boy. He's just ambitious." Arthur had coughed, a dry, painful sound, before shaking his head with absolute certainty. "Ambition is one thing, Martha. Greed is an abyss. People change the moment massive money is dangled in front of them. I've spent my life building things that last, and I won't watch everything we sweat blood for get sold off to pay for her vanity. We are locking this house into an irrevocable trust. You will be the sole trustee. Promise me you will never sign it away, no matter how much they beg or trick you." At the time, I thought Arthur was being overly paranoid. I agreed to the trust just to ease his final days, never truly believing a day would come when my own son and daughter-in-law would actively plot to throw me onto the street. Now, sitting alone in the quiet living room as the fading afternoon light painted the walls gray, the profound truth of Arthur's words crashed over me. My husband hadn't been paranoid. He had simply seen the future clearly long before I was willing to open my eyes. I opened my eyes and looked toward the front door. Ethan was still standing there on the porch, staring at me with a mixture of terror and overwhelming guilt. Chloe had already retreated down the steps toward her car, muttering curses under her breath, realizing her multi-million-dollar scheme had completely imploded. I didn't yell at them. I didn't cry. I simply stood up from Arthur's chair, walked over to the heavy oak front door, and grasped the brass knob. The past was written in blood, sweat, and concrete, and the future belonged to the unyielding law my husband had left behind to protect me. As dusk settled over the quiet outskirts of Raleigh, painting the sky in cold shades of violet and gray, the heavy iron front gate clicked shut against the evening wind. Attorney Julian Vance returned just after 7 o'clock, carrying a heavy leather briefcase in one hand and a small weathered mahogany box in the other. It was the box Arthur had kept locked in his office safe for decades, containing papers he deemed more valuable than currency. Without a word of greeting, Julian walked straight into the kitchen and placed the wooden box gently on the worn oak table. He left explicit instructions with me on the day we drafted the trust. Julian said quietly, his voice measured and professional. He told me to hand this over to you the exact moment the mask fell and the truth revealed itself. I reached out, my calloused fingers tracing the faded brass clasp. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a single thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored paper, sealed tightly with dark red wax. Across the front, written in Arthur's familiar steady handwriting, were 6 words: "For Martha, when the first mask falls." I broke the wax seal, unfolded the heavy paper under the warm glow of the kitchen light, and read my late husband's final words, written during his final months of illness. "My dearest Martha." Arthur's voice seemed to echo softly in the quiet, empty room. "If you are reading this letter, it means my worst fears have come to pass. It means our son and his wife have chosen greed over family, trying to trade our life's work for status. But listen to me carefully, my love. Do not use the full force of the law to destroy our flesh and blood with prison cells or permanent ruin. Indictments only make people bitter, not better. Use the truth instead. Strip away their illusions and let reality do its work. Remember this: the seed of true remorse never sprouts until a person is forced to carry the full weight of what they have destroyed with their own hands." I carefully folded the letter, gently smoothed the hard edge of the dark red wax seal, and let my finger trace the familiar ink of his signature one last time. I sat completely still in the quiet kitchen, letting the profound wisdom of his words settle deep into my bones as a heavy, profound silence stretched across the empty room for a long, unmeasured moment. Nothing moved except the faint ticking of the wall clock, giving space for the dust of the past to settle. Over the next few weeks, the legal fallout swept through our community with ruthless, unyielding precision. The multi-million-dollar real estate transaction was formally canceled and shredded at the Wake County Title Registry office. The prospective buyers received every single cent of their deposit back through the escrow system, fully protected from the fraud, and walked away from number 402. The State Real Estate Commission acted swiftly. Melissa avoided a criminal indictment because she cooperated with federal investigators, but her broker license was suspended for 3 years, and she was forced to complete hundreds of hours of mandatory ethics retraining. A devastating career collapse for someone who had traded her reputation for a quick commission check. As for Chloe, the moment the illusion of wealth dissolved, her loyalty vanished into thin air. 3 days after the confrontation, while Ethan was still dazed from the wreckage of their failed scheme, Chloe's designer luggage disappeared from the hallway of their apartment. She didn't leave a note, a text, or a word of explanation. She packed her luxury car, cleared out their joint checking account down to the last dollar, and drove out of his life forever, leaving my son legally stranded and financially ruined. Ethan came back to number 402 late one rainy Friday night. He didn't knock on the front door this time. He pulled up quietly in a battered old car he had barely managed to keep. He stood out on the wet driveway, drenched by the relentless storm, wearing a wrinkled jacket with his hair grown long and unkempt, staring up at the warm golden light of my porch. He looked broken, stripped of every arrogant defense Chloe had ever built around him. I watched him from the living room window through the gap in the curtains. I didn't rush out to open the door, nor did I turn the porch light off. Arthur's words echoed clearly in my mind. I had protected the home we built through 35 years of blood, sweat, and concrete. The briars had been cleared, the truth had spoken, and the path ahead belonged to those who finally had to face the consequences of their own choices. The rain fell in heavy, relentless sheets on a cold Tuesday afternoon, drumming a steady, hollow beat against the roof of number 402, blurring the edges of the quiet neighborhood in a gray, watery haze. I was standing by the kitchen counter, slowly pouring a quiet cup of black coffee to warm my hands, when the low crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway caught my attention. I glanced through the window, watching the water drip from the drooping eaves. Ethan stood on the front porch, completely drenched to the skin, shivering uncontrollably against the biting autumn wind. He looked nothing like the confident corporate manager who had smugly stood beside his wife weeks ago, radiating arrogance and false security. He had lost a dramatic amount of weight, his cheeks sunken and hollow, stripped entirely of the youth he used to take for granted. Dark purple bruises of total exhaustion stained the skin beneath his bloodshot eyes, and his shoulders were permanently curved under an invisible, crushing weight. I knew from mutual acquaintances that he had already been forced to resign from the marketing firm he co-founded with Chloe, stripped of his position, his marriage, and his financial standing, all in one swift, catastrophic blow. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor to the heavy oak front door, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway, and turned the brass deadbolt. I pulled it open just enough to let him see me, keeping my expression entirely neutral, devoid of any warmth, pity, or malice. Ethan didn't speak right away. With trembling fingers, he slowly unbuckled and pulled off his soaked cap, letting the water pool heavily onto the porch boards at his feet. He didn't try to step into the carpeted living room or cross the boundary of my home. Instead, he dropped straight to his knees on the wooden floorboards right at the threshold, the exact spot where, 30 years before, his father and I had taught him how to take his very first unsteady steps. With ice-cold, shaking hands, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small set of items, and placed them meticulously on the wood floor. His wet car keys, the master keys to his empty rented apartment, and a crumpled, printed copy of his formal job resignation. "Mom," Ethan's voice cracked, raw and shredded by days of unbroken silence and sleepless panic. "I was a fool. I let her manipulate every thought in my head, and I believed we were entitled to everything without ever earning it. I signed those papers without reading a single word." He buried his face in his wet hands, his broad shoulders shaking with dry, agonizing sobs that echoed off the bare walls. She had cleaned out their joint accounts down to the last cent and left him legally stranded, fleeing the moment the illusion of wealth vanished like smoke. I looked down at my only son, watching the rain cascade down his back. I wanted to hug him. I didn't. 58 years of hardship had taught me that coddling a drowning man only makes him panic and sink faster. The true punishment wasn't anything I could verbally inflict. It was the absolute crushing collapse of his own mind, forcing him to live every single day with the unbearable wreckage he had built with his own arrogance. I turned around, walked over to the kitchen desk, and picked up a single sheet of paper I had prepared earlier that morning, its edges crisp and unyielding against the quiet air. I walked back to the doorway and held the paper out toward him. Ethan lifted his head slowly, his red-rimmed eyes staring up at the document with a mixture of terror, guilt, and lingering desperation, waiting for his final judgment. It wasn't a legal restraining order or an outright banishment from my life. It was a typed list of strict, unyielding conditions, a hard roadmap for what it would take, starting tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock sharp with a heavy shovel, a rusty hammer, and honest, grueling physical labor to even earn the right to step across this threshold and look me in the eye again. "Read it carefully, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, calm, and completely unyielding against the sound of the storm outside. "Then decide if you still have the backbone to walk through this door. 1 full year has passed since the afternoon the commercial moving truck pulled away from number 402, leaving nothing behind except the cold reality of deception and the quiet foundation of an unyielding truth. Today, the suburban street outside our window looks just as it always did, yet the air inside the house carries an entirely different weight, one of profound, hard-earned peace that no court order or forged document could ever manufacture. Ethan didn't walk away from the strict conditions I laid out on that rainy Tuesday. He took them head-on without a single word of complaint. He quit the fast-talking corporate marketing circuit completely, traded his expensive designer suits for rugged denim and heavy work boots, and secured a grueling entry-level job as a public utility maintenance technician for the municipal water department. Every single morning at 5 o'clock, long before the sun crests over the suburban horizon, he leaves for the underground pipelines and municipal pump stations, his hands growing calloused, his skin weathered by the elements, and his back aching with genuine physical fatigue, earning every single dollar through the honest sweat of his brow, exactly the way his father once did 30 years ago. Life, at number 402, has fallen back into a rhythm as steady and comforting as the ticking of an old clock. On quiet Saturday mornings, Ethan can often be found outside in the crisp yard, quietly hammering a loose board or fixing the backyard wooden fence with the old tools his father left behind, while I stand by the porch steps, gently watering the blooming flower beds under the warm morning sun. The air is filled with the cheerful chirping of sparrows in the maples and the soft rustle of the autumn wind whispering through the branches. The true turning point came quietly on the second anniversary of Arthur's passing. Instead of staying at number 402, we traveled out to the coast, gathering at the quiet seaside property in the Outer Banks that was secured under the Miller Family Protection Trust years prior. The Atlantic wind swept across the coastal dunes, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the ocean spray and the endless roar of the surf. Ethan stood near the edge of the weathered wooden deck, staring out past the crashing white waves toward the vast, open horizon where the sky met the deep blue water. His posture was straight and grounded, entirely stripped of the arrogant entitlement and superficial posturing that Chloe had cultivated in him for years. He turned his head, looking over at me as I leaned quietly against the porch railing, holding a warm cup of tea. I used to think inheritance meant walking into a house you never helped pay for, collecting money you never earned, and pretending you were better than everyone else. Ethan said, his voice steady, clear, and completely devoid of arrogance over the sound of the surf. It took losing everything, the illusion, the marriage, the fake status, the arrogance, to finally realize what Dad actually meant when he set up that trust. It wasn't about shutting me out, Mom. It was about saving me from myself. It gave me a second chance to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet as a decent human being. I didn't offer a grand theatrical speech or a tearful embrace. I simply looked out at the endless expanse of the ocean, letting the rhythmic power of the tide fill the quiet space between us. Later that evening, back inside the house, as the sea breeze cooled the rooms, I walked quietly into the corner of the back sewing room. I reached down and gently touched the heavy iron wheel of my mother's old Singer sewing machine, listening to its faint, familiar mechanical click. I didn't pull it out to stitch heavy winter coats this time, nor did I pack it away in a box of panic or hiding. I simply adjusted the linen cover as the final rays of the evening sun pierced through the window glass, casting a warm, golden beam across the polished pine floorboards. I never asked Ethan whether he deserved forgiveness. Somewhere between those quiet mornings, the rhythmic clatter of the sewing machine, and the long afternoons of honest physical work, life had already answered that question for both of us. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.